Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, just as Budget 2016 was a budget built of broken promises, so Budget 2017 is an insubstantial rehashing and doubling down on last year's bad ideas, replete with the shameless repetition of catchphrases rendered meaningless by this government's actions to date. It's no secret, Mr. Speaker, that this budget was widely panned. I talked to a number of people in Calgary who couldn't understand how this government can run these large deficits without having anything to show for it and without any economic justification. One constituent said that the budget presented by the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, quote, under the disguise of support for the middle class, is a hoax, an insult to the intelligence of Canadians, unquote. She went on to say that the Liberals are, quote, not building a stronger middle class, so please stop with this insulting, embarrassing, foolish facade. Andrew Coyne called it a nonsense-filled budget, but perhaps the quote from last week's National Post sums it up best in describing the budget as, quote, 278 pages of flowery verbiage dressed up in the thin veneer of marketing speak. The whole thing will be forgotten by the weekend. While it's mostly true that this budget is so thin on substance that the news cycle has already forgotten it, the debt, though, that this budget piles on certainly cannot be forgotten that easily. I mentioned this government's penchant for meaningless catchphrases, so I'll remind members of this House that this government promised unprecedented transparency, sound economic stewardship resulting in greater rates of growth, fairness for the middle class and those working hard to join it, and attentive consultation with all Canadians. All empty platitudes coming from this Liberal government.
Particularly that member.
In the last election, they also promised maximum deficits of $10 billion and a return to the balanced budget that the Parliamentary Budget Office confirmed the Liberals inherited when they formed government. So what of these so-called modest deficits that were promised? Well, hearing any talk of anything modest from a Liberal should have been a red flag, but Canadians elected them anyway on a promise that the maximum $10 billion deficits would be incurred strictly in order to fund infrastructure projects that would immediately facilitate economic activity and real GDP growth. Well, it didn't happen, and this budget, with its $28 billion now structural deficit and no hint of even a timetable to return to surplus, along with downgraded growth projections, leaves no room for this government to deny that they broke the central promise of the last campaign. And they make no apologies for breaking their promise, and they have no intention of even trying to keep it. They're simply hoping nobody noticed. But Canadians have noticed. And while Canadians are forgiving people and will forgive an honest mistake, they will not forgive a broken trust. It's widely known that when Liberals do get thrown out of office, they're historically brought down by their own arrogance and corruption. Yet arrogance and corruption are at the core of the Liberals' big government knows best political philosophy. Arrogance in the technocrats' conceit that a small group of self-styled experts know better than millions of individuals making choices in their own interest. And corruption, which inevitably crops up when a small group of insiders have the power to control economic activity through regulation and to pick corporate winners and losers. The latter point is evident by Budget 2017's corporate welfare agenda. It boasts almost $1.3 billion over 6 years of investment in 6 main economic priorities like clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and agri-food. To be clear, these may well be important fields of economic development, assuming these fancy-sounding terms can be defined and actually mean something. But when it comes to business, when a government says invest, it actually means spend, which actually means subsidize. Likewise, when it says that they'll spend over $1.7 billion over 6 years on, among other things, spawning superclusters, offering state-supplied venture capital to favored firms, and twisting procurement policy to let taxpayers bear the risk of testing out Canadian products, it means that the government will try to steer the economy towards its pet priorities with no regard to the desires of Canadians free to choose their own priorities in a free market. This opens the door for economic distortion and corruption, since interested firms will inevitably try to curry favor with this government in order to get their share of its subsidies, perhaps doing so at a Cash for Access fundraiser, but I digress. Returning, Mr. Speaker, to the main point about this budget, it is laced with simplistic, idealistic depictions of a world which the Liberals wish existed instead of the complex reality at hand. Even the cover art on Budget 2017 suggests a possible Freudian slip, showing that Liberals know that their promises are merely illusions. We have the illusion of useful infrastructure actually being built by a government that is simply making endless project announcements. We have the illusion of timely medical care for the elderly under a government which ignores real threats to the sustainability of the single-payer system and has yet to deliver on its palliative care promises. We have an illusory guitar and recording system in the hands of a creative young woman, apparently put there by the same government that eliminated the children's arts and fitness tax credits. And we have the illusion of solar-powered fishing boats and effective wind power production under a government whose senior PMO advisors were the architects of the Ontario Liberals' disastrous Green Energy Act. The back cover art doodles also depict the Liberal vision of the world in their idealized economy. There are scientific equipment, wind turbines, bicycles, happy families, and recreational fishing boats, but there are no mines, no oil rigs, no farms, no cut timber. There is no primary industry and no recognition of the millions of jobs which depend on natural resources. Speaking of wishful thinking, Budget 2017 contains many aspirational phrases which ring hollow when set against the government's record. For example, on page 178, they say that in Canada, we have made a choice to build an economy that works for everyone, even as this Prime Minister and his party can barely contain their disdain for the resource and agricultural sectors. Budget 2017 says on page 204 that, quote, the government remains committed to building a fair tax system that benefits the middle class and those working hard to join it. Yet this government cannot and will not define what that even means, since it has no definition of middle class. One of my personal favorites, on page 214, Budget 2017 claims that, quote, the government is committed to enhancing the transparency and accountability of federal borrowing activities to Parliament and ultimately Canadians. This from a government which, as we speak, is trying to change the standing orders of the House of Commons without all-party consent. The ability of this government to speak of transparency with a straight face in the midst of an unprecedented attack on democratic parliamentary privilege would be hilariously ironic if the stakes were not so high. This government's vision of transparency would centralize even more powers into the hands of a small executive, would diminish Parliament's ability to hold the government to account, and would allow the party in power to unilaterally change parliamentary procedure for its own convenience. They see members of Parliament and their democratic prerogatives as a nuisance, oblivious to the fact that every member of Parliament, regardless of which caucus they sit in, won an election to represent their constituents. And the ones on this side of the House were elected by people that do not share this government's views, and they have the right to have their voices heard in the House by their members of Parliament that they elected. In fact, I still can't figure out whether the timing of this budget was meant to distract attention from the Liberals' power grab at Proc or the other way around. Both the budget and their actions at Proc are surely embarrassing to this government. It would be better covered up by a stronger news story. So the question is, which embarrasses this government more? Again, I digress. Mr. Speaker, instead of offering trendy buzzwords that signify nothing, this government should serve Canadians through practical and tangible measures. This budget repeats the word innovation some 200 times, but Canadians know that just repeating a word over and over again will not get unemployed Canadians back to work. Saying the words venture capital catalyst, supercluster, or infrastructure bank on the cocktail party circuit might make a Liberal feel clever, but words won't balance a budget, grow the economy, or lift anybody out of poverty. Merely announcing or re-announcing infrastructure projects won't get shovels into the ground. Instead, the government should rein in their out-of-control spending in the tax increases that it requires. They should reverse course on taxes like the carbon tax, follow the example of Conservatives that brought federal taxes to their lowest point in 50 years while returning to a balanced budget on schedule. They should reduce regulation to increase the creative and innovative energy currently trapped in red tape. They should fulfill their own broken promise and reduce the small business tax rate, reverse their ill-conceived and poorly timed job-killing payroll tax. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, they should quit trying to think of new ways to nickel and dime money out of Canadians while flailing in a sea of red ink, broken promises, rhetorical nonsense, all against the backdrop of an ethics investigation and an unprecedented attack on democratic accountability. Mr. Speaker, this budget may well have been designed to be forgotten quickly. I wish it were so.